Hi folks, welcome to this video on sport, society and culture in pre-1850 or pre-industrial Britain. What I'd say this is going to be one of a series of ones where we look at how various factors, now the factors quoted by the exam board are social class, gender, law and order, education and literacy, availability of time and money and availability of transport, all of which I will deal with on this video, have changed from early 1800s onwards, or even late 1700s onwards, and therefore affected the sports and activities and pastimes that people took part in. The questions that you could get on this section could be various. You could be asked to describe the factors that led to participation during a certain time period, such as this one here, or you could get asked how factors changed from pre to post 1850 and onwards. So you could be asked to do a comparison. So what I'm going to do with each video is, in this series, is look at pre-1850, post-1850, 20th century and 21st century. And so we can see what factors have changed and how they've affected participation. So what do we mean by socio-cultural? Well, I've just, taken a definition and tried to make it into my own terms. How communities and their people affected the development of sport over time. Sociocultural is a word I struggle with because whatever is social is also cultural. What's big in your culture, what's big in your society at that time is kind of the same thing, hence why I think they're now referred to it as sociocultural. So what was going on in the UK, in Britain, pre-1850, before 1850? And the reason we use this term pre-industrial is the Industrial Revolution that occurred in Britain had a massive impact on many things, but including sport, pastime, our money, our transport, leisure time, things like that. So pre-industrial revolution, pre-1850 is before the Industrial Revolution. The next video in this series will look at how things changed during and after the Industrial Revolution. Right, we live in a world now where there is generally, people are classified, and whether this should be or not, is irrelevant, but it happens, into three classes of people: the lower classes or the working classes, the middle classes and the upper classes. And those phrases are used, lower working class, generally poorer backgrounds. Middle classes, they've done well for themselves, earn a bit of money, but they're not mega rich. And the upper classes are your totally rich people doing very, very well for themselves. If we go back to pre-1850, pre-industrial Britain, there was actually only two classes of people. There are your working or your lower classes. I'm going to use one term, both terms. So, if I flit in between the two, you know what I'm talking about. And there were the upper classes. The lower classes were peasants. They worked on the land and they were very poorly paid. So what we're talking about here is we're going back to an era where you were either a landowner, i.e. you were upper class, you were rich, you were aristocracy, and you owned the land, or you were a working class and you worked on the land. We're talking about a time before big industry, before big cities, when a lot of the industry in this country was just farming communities spread out equally across the country. Sport didn't exist in any way like we know it now, back in these times, not at all. And your class affected the activities / sports that you did. So working class people would do things like these, mob games. Now, this is where two villages would come and meet and just knock hell out of each other over possession of a ball, usually the ball being a pigskin, pig's bladder, blown with leather wrapped around it, where footballs have eventually evolved into. And this is kind of the point of this little topic. But mob games, very violent games. One village versus another, knocking hell out of each other. Prize fighting is a posh term for bare knuckle fighting, with people putting what little money they had on gambling on fighters to try and make themselves a little bit richer. And also things like dog fighting, activities that we really despise and look down upon today. These were the only options. These were the only activities, sports, pastimes, hobbies, whatever you want to call them, for working class people. So, we could even draw a little arrow in there to emphasize that these people did those activities. The upper classes, by the same token, they had things like cockfighting. Always going to raise a laugh, isn't it? It might be what you think it is. Hopefully it's not. Cockfighting is where you had two cockerels, so two male chickens who used to have like metal spikes put onto the feet, and they would be put in a pit together and they would attack and savage each other. The one that was still alive at the end was the winner. And there was a lot of money gambled on cockfighting. They had rail tennis, lawn tennis. The tennis that we know has come from rail tennis, but rail tennis, very, very complicated game, hardly played these days. But indoors, big, massive arenas needed. In terms of at the time, you need to devote an entire room to play this. and fox hunting, activity that we still associate the upper classes with today. What can we say here? Well, what do all these activities have in common? Very few rules associated with these sports. Violent and cruel, all three of them. Wagering and gambling took place. And they were, let's be honest, they were simple activities for simple people, not not educated at all, sorry. These were peasants, land workers, poorly paid. So they tried to gamble what little money they had to get rich quickly. Violent and cruel, very few rules. So that kind of sums up these three sports here. Now, looking at the upper classes, the gentry, these sports, again, there's some similarities, some differences, but generally more sophisticated rules, certainly not in cockfighting. It's the same as dog fighting, just using different animals. But if you ever go on YouTube, type in rail tennis and watch it. If you can figure out what's going on, you're a genius, because it is absolutely ridiculous. Fox hunting, there aren't too many rules to it, but it's a little bit more sophisticated than dog fighting as a comparison. But they're still violent and cruel. They're still wagering and gambling, but this time for vast sums of money, because these people are really, really rich. There's a lot of expensive equipment and facilities as well. If you're going to play rail tennis, you need to dedicate an entire room in your house towards it. If you're going to do fox hunting, you need to have stables. You need to have horses. You need to have big, massive land where you all go riding to catch the fox in the first place. To have cockfighting, you used to have specialist pits where it would all take place. So it's looking at, these are substantially more upper class activities, yet they still have violent and cruel and wagering and gambling at the heart of them. So your social class certainly affects which sports you can do. However, there are sports that both take part in. Pedestrianism and cricket. Now, you might not believe what pedestrianism is, but literally these four guys here are footmen or butlers to the aristocracy. And they would literally, rich families would have their footmen or butlers race each other. Again, cross-country races. So they have to be fit footmen or fit butlers. The word footman is, these are the days before cars, before transport. So sometimes you might have seen these on these old films where they sit in a box and you have 6-8 people carrying them, with big wooden poles hanging either side of the box, and they would walk along. That was a footman. Or a footman would run alongside a horse-drawn carriage as it was being pulled through the countryside to make sure that their master was always happy and always had a drink and something to eat. So these were people who were naturally very fit people. So they would race their footmen and their butlers against each other, again, for wagering. And some people might call it a little bit violent and cruel. Absolutely right. But we also had cricket as well. Now, why is cricket a sport played by both? Because we naturally associate this with slightly being more upper class. Well, apart from the working classes working for the upper classes, the only other place the two would meet is in the local pub in the villages and things like that. Now, as you probably already know today, a lot of pubs still have cricket teams. Cricket has a lot of its origins. A lot of the cricket teams in this country have its origins from pub backgrounds. So what they used to do is used to meet there. Now, each cricket team would be made of gentlemen amateurs, okay? And it would be made of, in inverted commas, players. And there were two types of people who would play in the cricket team. The players, who were the paid lower classes, the working classes, who were good enough to get in the team. And they would play alongside the gentlemen amateurs, who were the upper classes, who did not get paid because they were rich enough. But anyway, they saw payment as being vulgar. You don't get paid to play sport. Now, this is where the early amateurs and the early professionals first come into sport. Some sports have lived their entire lifetime as amateur. Rugby union was amateur in this country up until the early 1990s, whereas rugby league went very professional, i.e. paid performers very early on. And that's something you need to be familiar with. A professional is someone who gets paid to play. An amateur, it's not they're amateur, they're a beginner. Amateur, the proper term, means someone who plays but does not get paid to play. The upper classes saw the idea of payment to play as vulgar. It's below them. I'm rich enough as it is, I don't need to get paid to play cricket. Whereas the upper class is very poor, they needed to get paid to play. But those that were good enough would get paid to play. So what I'll try to do in this first slide here is show you that there were two classes back in Britain in the pre-1850 era, pre-industrial era, and your class would affect the activities that you could do. But there were the odd sport, pedestrianism and cricket, where the two classes would meet. But this was very, very rare. And even if you look at it, pedestrianism and cricket, The upper classes are still treating the working classes very poorly. You know, they're rather racing them against each other here or paying them, but seeing it as vulgar anyway. But we're going to look at the key factors that affected these people and these people, the working class and the upper classes, and how that affected which activities they did as well. Now, as I said right at the start of the video, there are various factors that the exam board want you to know about, and these are the socio-cultural factors that we mentioned. Social class is one, but social class we just looked at the previous slide fits in with all of these: gender, law and order, transport, education, literacy, and availability of time and money. We're just going to quickly go through each of these, so this is going to be quite brief, okay? I've just had to remind myself, you know, factors affecting participation. This is pre-1850s, pre-industrial Britain. So back in these days, before 1850, gender, you women were seen as the weaker sex. Sadly, in some people's eyes, it still continues on today. It's absolutely ridiculous, I know. But it was much stronger then, and it was a wide-held belief. So as a result, the women would do less demanding sports. The upper-class women would do archery, things that didn't require more skill than physical power, strength, stamina, things like that. Whereas the lower class women would do something called a smock race. They didn't have much money, not for clothes, and you barely had enough money to buy food and things like that. So literally the lower class women would take part in a smock race, which was a race to win a dress or a smock that had often been donated from the upper classes, not in a nice, kind way, as a thrown out, you know, I don't want this anymore, you peasants can have it kind of way. So there were the activities, you know, that's how gender could affect your participation. The working class men could do dog fighting, prize fighting, mob football, but the lower class women could only do things like smock races. The upper class men could do fox hunting, they could do cockfighting, they could do rail tennis, whereas the upper class women would do things like archery instead. If we quickly have a look at law and order, you might remember from the previous slide where I've said, you know, even though they had different sports for upper and lower class people, there were still common things where very violent and cruel: dog fighting, cockfighting, prize fighting, fox hunting, blood sports, what we sometimes call that. Well, that's reflective of the times. Law and order in pre-1850s, they were cruel, harsh times. We still had public executions and people would go down and watch them as a form of entertainment. There was very little law and order, and it was difficult to instill in people. So the lower class had violent sports, mob football, bare knuckle fighting, but the upper classes also had, you know, cockfighting, which was a violent sport, and fox hunting as well. So, you know, law and order, very little law and order, reflecting a cruel time, and the activities and sports played reflected that as well. We'll come down to education and literacy now. Basically, the upper classes, they were educated, hence why they were always in power and they were always rich. They were the educated ones. So they would deliberately write written and complicated rules for their sports, such as things like rail tennis. That automatically allows them to keep those sports for themselves, because the lower classes will never be able to understand the rules to start with. Whereas the lower classes were uneducated. There was no schools at this time for working class people. There were no state schools. So if you were uneducated, you stayed uneducated for your entire life. So you were illiterate your entire life. So the only rules you could have were simple verbal rules. So your sports, mob football, was just two, like, populations of two villages knocking hell out of each other. And the only rule was no murder, no manslaughter. Well, that's it. So, you know, so that there was definite sports for some people based on, you know, the quality of their education. Now, these final two are fairly obvious and straightforward. Availability of time and money. The lower classes, remember, you worked on the land, you worked long hours and you got little pay for it. So there's a little opportunity for sport. Maybe you got to do these sports 2 to 3 times per year on bank holidays. So you might have played mob football twice a year, or you might have took part in prize fighting twice a year, or dog fighting twice a year. Whereas the upper classes, the landowners, they were rich. I've got peasants working on my land for me, so I'd have to work myself. There's money in the family, so I'd have to have a job. So there's lots of time for sport, and therefore lots of money. And you could afford to keep horses. You could afford to have a cockfighting pit. You could afford to have a rail tennis court in your house. So your time and money, again, affected which sports you could play. And finally, transport then. But again, transport's going to be linked to time and to money, sorry. But back in these days, pre-1850s, the only form of transport is horse-drawn carriage. So straight away, the upper classes the only ones who can afford horse-drawn carriage. However, even if you did have a horse-drawn carriage, there are very poor and very few roads knocking about. Only the upper classes could afford to get a horse-drawn carriage and use these roads, so they could travel slightly further afield for their sports and their activities. They could go to the next estate and do fox hunting and things like that. But peasants, you working classes, in other words, you had to walk. So you only took part in activities within your local villages. Hence why mob football, for example, was one village versus the neighbouring village, because you couldn't afford to get anywhere else. You couldn't have one village in the north against a village in the south. There was no public transport. So it's very local. And, even the prize fighting, mainly at country fairs once, twice, three times a year, all within your locality. So that's everything to do with the factors affecting participation in pre-1850s, pre-industrial revolution. I advise you the next video you watch is what happened post-1850 in post-industrial Britain. Hope you found this video useful, folks.